I woke up to a sound that didn't belong, shouting, sharp and panicked, followed by the unmistakable thundering crash of something large and angry. My heart stopped for half a second before it kicked into overdrive. I threw back the covers, bolted out of bed, and didn't even stop for boots or a jacket. I ran out the front door in nothing but socks and sweatpants, feet sliding on cold wooden steps slick with morning dew. And there it was, pure chaos. Tank, my bull, my pride, my biggest responsibility, was tearing down the middle of Maplewood Lane like a runaway locomotive. His hooves hit the pavement so hard I could feel the tremors in my chest. A trash can bounced off a parked car with a metallic clatter. Newspapers fluttered through the air like panicked birds. Neighbors in pajamas stumbled out onto their porches, mouths open in disbelief. I caught sight of little Bobby Whitaker diving behind a row of hydrangeas, his cereal bowl flying out of his hands and shattering on the sidewalk. And then I heard her, Mrs. Whitaker, standing on her porch in an old bathrobe and hair curlers, clutching her cat so tightly the poor animal looked like it might suffocate. She screamed over and over, half threats, half prayers, something about calling the sheriff and having me arrested for public endangerment. My goats, meanwhile, had found their way into the Jamesons' yard and were munching happily on a $300 ornamental hedge. My chickens were scratching furiously at a flower bed so immaculate it could only belong to one person, Gerald. And there he was, arms folded, chest puffed out, standing right on the edge of his perfectly edged driveway like he was watching a show he paid for. His face was smug enough to make my fists clench. He didn't look scared or surprised, just satisfied. He'd been waiting for this. Ever since he moved in next door with his imported fountains and overpriced lawn statues, he had made it clear, my farm didn't belong here. It was unsightly. It was noisy. It lowered property values. He had filed complaints, sent emails, showed up at HOA meetings to demand action. I had tried to be patient, to be neighborly. But now, standing barefoot in the middle of the street, with my animals scattered and my bull nearly causing a car accident, I knew this wasn't bad luck. My fences were strong. I checked them every night. Tank never broke loose, not without help. Someone had done this. Someone had deliberately let my animals out. I didn't need to guess who. But the worst part? Standing on Gerald's porch, clipboard in hand, was Karen. President of the HOA. Pearls around her neck, pressed khakis that had never seen dirt, and that polite, brittle smile she wore like armor. She caught my eye across the chaos and tilted her head ever so slightly. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes spoke loud and clear, "This is only the beginning." And in that moment, with Tank disappearing around the corner and sirens faint in the distance, I realized something else. They weren't just trying to annoy me. They were trying to destroy me. By the time I managed to wrangle Tank back home, bribing him with a feed bucket and speaking in the calmest voice I could muster while my hands trembled, the sheriff's cruiser was already parked at my front gate. Deputy Mark Reynolds stepped out, expression tight with frustration, and beside him, as predictable as sunrise, stood Gerald and Karen. Gerald wore that same smug expression, arms crossed like he'd just caught a criminal in the act. Karen stood just a step behind him, her face carefully composed into polite concern, but her eyes glimmered with something colder, satisfaction. The deputy sighed. "Ethan, this is the third time this week. We've had multiple calls about your animals getting loose. Folks are starting to worry." I shook my head, breath still ragged from chasing Tank halfway through town. "I didn't let them out, Mark. Someone's messing with my fences." Gerald let out a soft snort that I swear was rehearsed. "Maybe you just need to spend less time sipping coffee and more time actually maintaining your property." Karen didn't say a word, but the way she nodded faintly in agreement was worse than any insult. The deputy gave me a warning that another incident could lead to citations and fines. Gerald looked ready to throw a parade. Karen patted his arm like they'd just won some civic battle. As they turned to leave, Gerald shot me a smirk and muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Better keep a closer eye on things, Turner." But it was Karen's final glance over her shoulder that made the hairs on my neck stand up, eyes narrowed, lips pursed in satisfaction. I spent that evening walking the fence line inch by inch. At the far corner, just beyond the old oak, I found it, a clean slice through the wire, low to the ground, as if someone had crouched in the dirt with wire cutters and worked in the dark. My stomach twisted. I had my suspicion, but suspicion wasn't enough. I needed proof. The next morning, I drove straight to the supply store and bought 2 trail cameras. I mounted one low to the ground by the damaged fence line and one up in the tree nearby. I didn't tell a soul, not even Jake, my best friend who'd been helping me round up the animals all week. If I was going to catch them, I needed them to think they'd won. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the eaves made me sit bolt upright. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving along the fence line. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just prayed the cameras were working. At first light, I sprinted out to check the footage, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the clips. And there he was, Gerald, crouched at the fence, wire cutters in hand, snipping the metal like it was string. But it wasn't just the cutting that made my blood boil. It was what came next. He pulled a bag of animal feed from under his jacket, scattered it along the gap, and grinned, a wide, gleeful grin like a kid who'd gotten away with something. I made copies of that footage and waited. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That afternoon, another call, another accusation, another parade of judgment from Gerald and Karen. But this time, when Deputy Reynolds arrived, I didn't say a word. I just handed him the flash drive. His eyebrows rose as he watched the video in the squad car, Gerald still chattering on behind him. Mark's jaw tightened. He stepped out of the car slowly, eyes locked on Gerald. "Looks like we found our culprit." Gerald's face drained of color. He stammered, tried to spin some story about fixing the fence for me. Karen's expression shifted from smugness to sharp calculation in an instant. She placed a hand on Gerald's arm, but she wasn't defending him, she was distancing herself. The sheriff fined Gerald on the spot for vandalism and endangerment. It was steep enough to make his lips tighten like he'd just swallowed a lemon. But as they turned to leave, I heard Karen whisper in Gerald's ear, "You should have been more careful." And that was when I realized, she wasn't finished. For 2 days, things were quiet. I checked my fences twice a day, reinforced the coop doors, and even added new locks. Tank stayed in his pen, huffing and chewing contentedly. My goats roamed the pasture without issue, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. But peace on a farm like mine, especially with neighbors like Gerald and Karen, was never built to last. The first sign came on a Tuesday afternoon when I stopped by the local hardware store. Normally, folks greeted me with smiles, small talk, and the usual questions about fresh eggs or goat milk. But that day, I was met with silence and sidelong glances. Martha, the cashier who'd known me since I was a kid, barely made eye contact. I didn't understand it until I overheard 2 women whispering near the seed display. One of them said, "I heard his animals are sick. Some kind of parasite. Could be dangerous for kids." The other nodded gravely. "Karen from the HOA sent out a notice this morning. Said it's best to keep distance." My stomach twisted. Sick animals? Parasites? There wasn't a word of truth to it. My animals had all their vaccinations, their checkups, I was meticulous. But facts didn't matter once rumors took root. Karen, always so careful, so calculating, hadn't just stopped at fence sabotage. She was poisoning my reputation. By the end of the week, the feed store stopped offering me credit. The local market didn't want to carry my eggs. People who once waved at me in town now looked the other way. Even Jake admitted he'd heard the rumors. "They're saying you're running an unsafe farm," he said quietly. "Kids are afraid to walk past your property line." That night, I found an official-looking flyer taped to my gate, an HOA community alert, signed by Karen herself. It warned residents to avoid contact with potentially unsafe livestock and suggested that concerned families contact animal control. The next morning, animal control showed up unannounced. 2 officers in uniform with clipboards and grim expressions. They inspected every inch of my property, poked through the feed, checked the animals for signs of mistreatment. I cooperated, biting down my frustration, answering every question calmly. After 2 hours, they left without issuing a single citation. My animals were healthy. My farm was clean. But the damage was done. Word spread faster than truth. And still, Karen wasn't finished. That weekend, the HOA held a meeting. I wasn't invited. Jake, who attended as a guest, told me what happened. Karen stood at the front of the room and proposed a new bylaw, restricting livestock ownership within the neighborhood, citing safety hazards, noise pollution, and the potential decrease in property values. Her voice was sweet, measured, but every word was a knife aimed straight at my heart. She even brought printed photographs of my animals loose on the street, staged chaos she and Gerald had caused, and presented them as evidence of my negligence. According to Jake, not one person questioned her narrative. Then came the most humiliating blow. On Monday morning, a certified letter arrived. It was a formal notice from the HOA, requesting that I appear for a disciplinary hearing. The letter claimed repeated violations of community standards, potential safety hazards, and public disturbances. Signed, of course, by Karen. I stood on my porch, letter in hand, rage boiling under my skin. She wasn't just trying to ruin my reputation. She wanted to erase my farm, my livelihood, everything my father had built. I decided then and there, no more playing defense. I wasn't going to let her win. The night after receiving that letter, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like a warning. I sat on the porch long after dark, coffee cold in my hands, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. The floodlights I'd installed flickered now and then, triggered by passing rabbits or the rustle of leaves. But something told me it wouldn't be rabbits tonight. Around midnight, just as I started to drift into uneasy sleep in the armchair by the front door, the sharp scent of smoke jolted me upright. I rushed outside barefoot, the chill of the night forgotten. A faint orange glow flickered at the far edge of my property where the dry grass met the fence line. My heart seized. Fire. I sprinted toward the flames, grabbing a rusted old bucket by the barn on the way, heart hammering. The fire was small but spreading fast, crackling hungrily across the dry brush. I hurled water onto the flames, smoke burning my eyes and throat. Neighbors came running with hoses and buckets, forming a frantic, clumsy brigade. We managed to smother the blaze just before it reached the barn, but the damage was done: blackened fence posts, scorched grass, the acrid stench of burnt wood clinging to my clothes. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale with worry. I told him everything, about Gerald, the sabotage, the rumors, the false reports. But without hard evidence, his hands were tied. Gerald showed up too, of course, wide-eyed and innocent, shaking his head in mock disbelief. And Karen arrived not long after, dressed in spotless white linen pants and a silk blouse, clutching a thermos of coffee like she'd just wandered out of a spa retreat. She gasped dramatically, placing a hand over her heart, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This could have endangered the entire neighborhood. Something has to be done." Her hypocrisy nearly made me sick. But it wasn't until I reviewed my camera footage later that night that the full picture came into focus. At first, all I saw were shadows, but then, there they were, 2 figures moving stealthily along the fence line. One short and stocky, unmistakably Gerald, and one taller, broader, someone I didn't recognize. They carried wire cutters and what looked like a gas can. In the grainy footage, I could even make out Gerald whispering something, followed by the taller man setting fire to a patch of grass and both of them slipping away into the night. But more chilling was what I heard faintly in the background, Karen's voice, distant but clear enough, saying, "Make it look like his negligence put everyone at risk." My stomach twisted into knots. She wasn't just stirring up trouble. She was orchestrating all of it. Using Gerald and this mystery brute as pawns in her vendetta. I spent the next day upgrading every security measure I could think of. More cameras. New locks. Motion sensors covering blind spots. But this time, I decided to play smart. I wanted to catch them in the act, and I knew they'd be back. Sure enough, 2 nights later, the motion lights flared on just after 2 a.m. I slipped out the back door quietly, phone in hand, camera rolling. I rounded the barn and froze behind a stack of feed barrels. Gerald and his accomplice were back, and this time, they were trying to open the goat pen. The bigger man grunted in frustration as Gerald hissed directions at him. But they weren't the only ones watching. Tank stood at the far end of the pasture, head lowered, tail flicking, snorting like a storm was building inside him. Gerald took one step too close. Tank pawed the ground once, twice, then charged. The ground shook with every thunderous step. Gerald yelped and stumbled backward, falling flat on his back. His accomplice bolted, crashing headfirst into a bramble bush. Tank wasn't done. He bellowed, horns lowered, and sent Gerald rolling into a filthy water trough, sputtering and gasping. I could barely suppress a laugh as I filmed the whole scene. By the time the sheriff arrived, Gerald was soaked, scratched, and humiliated, his accomplice still tangled in thorny branches, cursing like a sailor. But Karen was nowhere to be found. She'd sent her pawns and stayed comfortably out of reach. Until now. I knew the footage in my hand wasn't just the smoking gun. It was the beginning of her downfall. Word spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, half the neighborhood had seen the footage of Gerald's humiliation, sprawled in a muddy trough, gasping for air while his accomplice flailed helplessly in the brambles. But what really set tongues wagging was the audio clip I handed to the sheriff, Karen's voice, cold and calculated, instructing them to make it look like my negligence had put everyone in danger. The sheriff didn't waste time. Gerald's accomplice was arrested on the spot, and Gerald faced multiple charges for trespassing, vandalism, and attempted animal endangerment. But Karen? She showed up at the sheriff's office, all smiles and denial, trying to paint herself as an innocent bystander. The sheriff wasn't buying it. He fined her heavily for inciting community unrest and filing false reports, but the real punishment came from the neighbors she once ruled over like a queen. The homeowners association turned on her overnight. People who once praised her for keeping the neighborhood pristine now whispered behind her back. At the next HOA meeting, they voted to strip her of her position. But the final blow came in the form of poetic justice. The court ordered both Karen and Gerald to perform community service on my farm. When Karen showed up in designer sneakers and sunglasses too big for her face, holding her nose like the air itself offended her, I knew it was going to be a satisfying 2 weeks. She shoveled manure, painted fences, and scrubbed the scorched barn siding, her polished nails chipping and her perfect hair frizzing in the sun. She tried once to fake a twisted ankle, but the cameras caught that too. The sheriff warned her sternly, one more stunt, and it would become a criminal offense. By the end of her sentence, something had shifted. She didn't glare at me as much. Once, while hauling hay, she muttered under her breath, "You really do care about this place." I didn't respond. She didn't deserve my words. A week after her final day, I saw her in her front yard, tending to her roses, no smirk, no clipboard, just a woman with dirt under her nails, quietly pulling weeds. Maybe the lesson stuck, or maybe she was just biding her time. Either way, my farm stood strong. Tank grazed peacefully, the fences were tight, and the neighbors who once doubted me now stopped by with smiles and apologies. I still keep the cameras running, not because I expect trouble, but because some people never change. Gerald moved away 3 months later. Karen stayed. And though things are quiet now, I'll never let my guard down. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that a Karen never truly disappears, she just waits for her next opportunity. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA rules or a neighbor like Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.